All right. Um, so just briefly about myself, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I teach at San Diego State. That's where I'm connected with Marcella and some of the other folks, and some of our teammates are also from San Diego State, and I see folks from the MFT program here. Um, I am a father to a wonderful little girl named Layla, and I'm so honored to have my wife here too, Katie. She's you can probably see her same last name. So none of the work that I do is possible without my family. The ways that they just support me both emotionally, my wife specifically financially, and all the Dill quads financially. So all the ways that I just have some wind in my sails to do the work that I do. Um, I am a drummer. I play music, piano and drums, and I surf. And so these are kind of two orienting uh, practices and hobbies that I have in my life that I find useful. And my work in the domestic violence world has spanned multiple contexts, including License to Freedom of obviously doing the domestic violence men's groups, the 52-week groups, doing some work with the term CWS groups, providing supervision, domestic violence response team. I worked in the shelter for a while in South Bay. Had the privilege of working across a number of contexts. And the way that I orient or some of the stated ethics and philosophies that I'm located in that I'll kind of cover briefly in this presentation but won't get too far into, as I've come to call it, is a post-structural decolonial feminism using narrative theory and practice to kind of bring those ethics and philosophies into a grounded practice. So, what I want to do here today in discussing some of the privilege and oppression in the domestic violence work, I'm going to start off with some really brief definitions that you might hear throughout the day. And what I want to do is kind of locate my learnings in some of the ways in my own story. Some of the ways that I came into the field with the aspirations and hopes as a helper. Some of the ways as an individual I wanted to be useful to communities and families. And then some of the ways that the system and the politics of the system start to shape my practices and necessarily move me into other contexts that may or may not be as helpful. I will say that I'm going to lean into a heavier critique here today. Not to dismiss the really important, beautiful work that people are doing, but to really highlight and make accountable some systems that are, in my opinion, are doing some serious harm. And if we're in a domestic violence context, we're wanting to talk about accountability and power and control. And I feel like that sense of accountability sometimes is not appropriately, uh, the DV field isn't appropriately subjected to those same analyses, in my opinion. And then my hope is to kind of discuss the politics of revolutionary love, like Dilquaz was saying. Like, love is like the central feature of domestic violence, which is kind of a strange thing to say. But it's love is usually a starting place and usually the complicated feature in which a lot of violence can be occurring. And it's the way that our team is connected and the ways that our team kind of wants to be in relationship with others and ways that in loving relationship we're inviting change and some different considerations. Okay, feel free to interrupt me as I go along. Marcella, if you give me a 15-minute, like, if when I'm 15 minutes away, because you know how I can be.
Sure.
Okay, so really quick, some brief definitions and perspectives. Domestic violence, broadly, it's a legal definition here in the United States. So I'll just refer to the mainstream legal definition, or like at least the functional definition that we use is ways that violence, unpreferred, non-consensual violence occurs in intimate partnerships, and within those partnerships, the ways that power is operating and works within particular social and political structures that relationships are within. So we could start to name patriarchy, heterosexism, uh, monogamy, Judeo-Christian values, right? All the various political power structures in which violence can be expressed through and with, if that makes sense. I'm going to be referring to culture here. I think generally speaking, we're referring to culture as any like bundle of ideas, feelings, thoughts, assumptions, filters of the world around us that we could kind of categorize and put together. And so that could be around ethnicity, race experiences. It could be, I'm kind of really connecting culture and language as one and the same in a lot of ways. Um, so you could talk about ethnicity. You could also talk about like surfing culture, right? Or like the culture of drummers within rock music, right? So whatever. So there's various ways that you could organize the idea of culture. So here I'm talking about domestic violence culture. I guess I want to like narrow that to the ways I'm talking about the United States and its relationship to this thing we call domestic violence and the field, the industry of domestic violence. So I'm gonna do my best. This is like not a strong suit for me to speak to these philosophical locations quickly, but I'm gonna do my best. And the reason that these things are named here is that they are positions of accountability for me, and they work really well together in my world. And I have the metaphor of the three sisters. So right now it's mid-April. It's time to start planting your mid to early to mid-summer crops. And the three sisters is a really um, a famous indigenous native North American planting a crop where you plant the corn first, and the corn starts to go up, build a strong structure, pulls nitrogen from the soil. Then you plant your beans. The beans use the structure of the corn to go up. They put nitrogen actually back in the soil, and then the squash you plant it right after, and it creates a really nice ground cover to protect from weeds. And corn, squash, and beans all provide all the nutrients you need in your body. So our human bodies are actually like very nicely prepared to take in these three things. So that's how I kind of think of my work. These three things work together and they nourish me in a lot of wonderful ways. So post-structuralism, in the briefest way I could say, is ways that I'm interested in being mindful of categorical assumptions of how power works, about how knowledge starts to filter and shape and create assumptions about the world, specifically through language, and how language creates borders and parameters around experience. So when I'm talking about violence, what exactly am I talking about? Is a pro-structuralist ethic, right? Like what are the parameters of violence? When is it conflict? When is it abuse? When is it consensual? When is it preferred, not preferred? Um, when we're talking about depression, when does depression start? When does it end? What is a relationship? What are the parameters of a relationship, of intimacy, right? So some of these like questions and raising, um, I guess putting a light on the frame and the edge of how we're talking about something is a post-structuralist practice, yeah, or ethic. So that's accounting to the modernist domestic violence field that I'm in, where we have very categorical constructions of people and experience, right? This is domestic violence, this is not, this is what males do with females, and these are gendered understandings, right? All those are huge cultural categories. Decoloniality speaks to my Americanism, so the ways that the United States exists within a long history of contemporary European colonization of the North Americas, of the global South, I guess you could say, um, and the ways that domestic violence knowledge, therapy, psychology are all colonial products of European thinking in the United States specifically at this point. So the decoloniality part is my accountability as I'm an Iranian American, cisgendered, heterosexual male working here in Southern California. My parents are immigrants from Iran. I speak Farsi and English. My family was displaced by the United States and British interventions in Iran, and I pay taxes here that continue to support the same sanctions and systems that oppress my family in Iran now. And so that complexity and that like necessity of existence to like support my family and like make sure my daughter has a future here, and the very direct impact that has on my family elsewhere, I think is one that maybe a lot of us share as displaced peoples in a post-colonial world. So that being said, I am still, and this is a really important like ethical position, is that whiteness is a matter of power, not genetics, as at least how I'm talking about it. And so when I'm working with the refugee immigrant community, I am white. I speak English. I was born here. I was educated here. I have citizenship status. I have access to various power structures like the police, etc. I'm white, effectively. So my decolonial ethic is to stay accountable to that. and a feminist ethic and philosophy about the ways that feminist authors, particularly in the United States, have brought language to the gender trouble and the gender trouble in which domestic violence occurs, and also addressing my own maleness and the blindness that my own maleness creates in a field where gender is a large influencer in how violence occurs. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going. But let me know if you have questions. I know I'm kind of rushing through a couple things here just because I want to get to some other stuff. Okay, so what I want to describe is some of the hopes and aspirations. And what I've done here is I've gone through some of the major uh, organizations in San Diego and through their mission statements, including LTF, drawing some of the language that they're using about what their stated hopes and ethics and aspirations are in addressing domestic violence. Okay, so these are from mission statements from providers. And this was my relationship to these mission statements as I went in as a new therapist. Also, this image right here that you can see. So what I've done is I went and I've captured images from artificial intelligence. So it's like this kind of neat process where you put in text and you give it to this AI software and it creates an artistic thing depending on what words you put in there and in English in this context. And so this image that you see here is a hopeful person as generated by an AI. So I just think it's interesting. I was telling Marcel, this is what I'm most excited about in my presentation. Um, okay, so you come into the field and you have some hopes and aspirations in domestic violence to promote safety in families. So what that might look like is creating some context where families can heal, where families can have access to resources easily, people can escape violence, you'll have immediate access to safety, right? Like you can pick up the phone or go somewhere and have access to safety away from violence, and some resources and support to get families through difficult periods, right? So you leave a violent relationship, let's say, and now you have some like support as a family to get through that process. Yeah. Um, so here's another tagline: promoting healthy communities. So how can families or communities have access to services and safety they need, like law enforcement, child protective services, adult protective services? And if you're familiar with a country, like I know for a long time, I actually haven't checked in on this recently, but like Iran didn't have child welfare services for a long time, which is was a critical problem. Yeah, did someone say something? Okay. So the lack of child welfare services, like we need a system like that to look out for our most vulnerable, right? Like children. Um, and providing resources to the community that prevent violence. Yeah. Um, bring the community together to end domestic violence. So, like for example, we have the San Diego Domestic Violence Council here in San Diego, and the idea is to support services and coordinate and collaborate so that people kind of have like a general. You can go to one shelter and get some services, and when you go to another shelter, there's kind of some familiarity on what others are doing, and you have a kind of a general, yeah, partnership between the people that you're trying to get help from. Uh, Kind of moving on here, providing trainings and outreach to educate communities about domestic violence. So one of the things a lot of our domestic violence field wants to do is let people know and notice and name domestic violence. And again, in the United States, it's really important to name that as one of the functions of patriarchy, historically in the United States, just as in a thin rendition, the white women's feminist grassroots movements of the early 20th century really brought the battered woman, to use that language, it made it visible. It brought it into a context to say, like, hey, gendered violence happens. This is an issue. We need to name it. And through a lot of blood, sweat, authorship, writing, feminist activists were able to make domestic violence visible. I say it's a function of patriarchy where Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State in the 80s, after cutting all the funding to social services and shelters. Before Reagan's administration, we had 25,000 DV grassroots agencies, feminist grassroots agencies, and after Reagan, we had 5,000. So like drastic cuts, moving all the funding into law enforcement and court systems. through that process, the Secretary of State gets up and says, "We as a society have come to recognize domestic violence." And the significance of that is it moves it away and obscures grassroots movements and places it into a cultural good of the United States. Like, oh, we're a progressive people. It kind of just really nicely dovetails with the white supremacy ideas that it's us European white people that have come to learn and know that domestic violence is wrong, and we're going to teach everyone else about it. Um, so our trainings and outreach to teach people about what we know about domestic violence are like 40-hour domestic violence trainings, and we have these nice trainings for people working with advocates, people working with, with survivors, people working with perpetrators. We teach people about the power and control wheel and the cycle of violence, which helps people feel not alone and isolated, and it actually kind of support this idea that the personal is political, which is a really strong feminist ethic, right? Like that the experiences you're having privately actually are there's a reason that other people are also having that private experience, and it's maybe this broader set of systems that teach men how to be violent or teach people how to be in gender trouble. So, like I said, making visible political structures. Some more hopes and aspirations is to build resilience and self-sufficiency. And if you've been in the nonprofit world long enough, I know that that phrase probably makes your stomach churn a little bit. But try and push that to the side and just remember your aspirational young self. And you're like, yeah, self-sufficiency and resilience and ways that we can empower women to access resources, and how survivors can, you can start a business and have like a whole new chapter in your life, right? Like to use that language. And then the ways that we're like thinking about the relationship between violence and trauma, and the ways that like we use trauma informed care models, um, how we hopefully address downstream effects of violence through various mediums of healing, um, and improve people's quality of life ultimately. I was so bright eyed. I was so excited. Um, how do we empower people to leave violent relationships? So we have a network of advocates in the county, in the field, in the system, where folks will go with people to restraining orders, support them with going to legal clinics. We can go to court with people. We can basically have advocates that support clients with many aspects of not just a domestic violence journey, but also rental assistance, access to food, etc. And then that we have systems that bring accountability to harm done. So we have the 52-week domestic violence programs, which is a 52-week group for perpetrators of violence. That's a group that we run at at License to Freedom. And that the court systems become places where justice occurs, where we negotiate and make sense of who needs to be accountable to their harm. Is my pacing okay? I feel like I'm kind of going quick. I have a little coffee in my system, and I'm also mindful of my hour thing, but I just want to just check in.
You're good. You still have about 30 minutes.
Okay, cool, sweet. That's good. All right. So I want to share a story. This is a story shared to me by my wife that has been a kind of a useful metaphor for me in how I make sense of the domestic violence field. So imagine you're walking down a river. It's a trigger warning, I guess. That's what you have to say these days. It's an intense metaphor, I think. My wife told me the other day it is. Um, you're walking down a river or field and you see a river, and in the river you look over, you're enjoying the day, and you see a baby flowing down. And you're like, oh my god, why is there a baby in this river? So you jump in the river and you pull the baby out, and while you're pulling that baby out, you see another baby coming down the river. So you start to see a whole bunch of babies coming down this river. So you start pulling the babies out, and you're like, oh my god, what's happening? Why are there all these babies in this river? Soon someone else walks by, you invite them into the river to help you, like, please help me. They get in. Pretty soon you have a good team of people pulling all these babies out of the river. So eventually someone's like, oh my god, like, what is happening? Someone should send somebody upstream to see why are all these babies in the river? Who's throwing these babies in the river? Good idea. The challenge is that now we're going to lose a pair of hands pulling the babies out of the river by sending someone upstream. So in doing that, we're going to lose people helping us getting the babies out of the river, but worthy, go upstream. And this is kind of just to like pause here in this story. This is the metaphor I'm using for how helpers come into the field, right? Like we see a problem, like Dilquaz's story. You notice a problem, and you want to get in there and help. You want to start pulling babies out the river, and there's a sacrifice in trying to figure out ways that people can go upstream, and we can call going upstream research or policy or whatever kind of broader political efforts we take to address problems. Here's the issue. Now you have a political context where your community of people who are pulling babies out the river have set up camp by the river and have created a nice system for how to pull babies out the river, but the system extends beyond just pulling babies out the river. You actually are sustaining your life by pulling babies out the river. So now my life sort of depends and my sustenance depends on babies being in the river and me pulling babies out the river. So my ethics shift a little bit, right? I'm still wanting to pull babies out the river, but it's not just about pulling babies out the river. It's how do we organize this camp and keep it sustainable and keep functioning to keep pulling babies out the river. This is an AI image of babies pulled out of the river. Kind of fascinating, I thought. That's what it created. So this is where I want to speak to the politics of the system, right? So the ways that now the individualized hopes and aspirations and love and ethics get consumed by the politics and organizations of the field, the industry, the marketplace of domestic violence services. Yeah. And the ways that that marketplace harbors white supremacy, neoliberalism, and neocolonial attitudes that are quite oppressive to the communities seeking that help. So I'm going to use the same headers and describe the way the politics or the kind of contemporary state of how those ethics are kind of being addressed, those mission statements that I went through. So they're the same ones. So we want to promote safety in families. However, domestic violence starting in the 80s became a criminal act, meaning that all domestic violence behavior or any engagement with domestic violence is considered through the lens of criminality. Meaning that like if you're arrested for domestic violence, you're going to be prosecuted through the criminal court systems. You're going to be subjected to the crime control model, which is very distinct from a due process model. I want to make this very explicit because everyone thinks America, land of the free, we have a just court system. No, if our court systems, especially within the crime control model, engage with the justice system that we think it engages with, our court system would collapse. We rely on plea deals. So what we are trying to do is DAs and lawyers are going back and forth to try and figure out what's the best deal for both the lawyers to win. And in the process, the defendant, the plaintiff, I'm sorry, not a lawyer. I guess what we did defendant in this context. The defendant is you're being told to plead guilty because you'll get a lesser charge. Now imagine you're an immigrant refugee that doesn't speak English, and your public defender is saying plead guilty, and you're saying, but I didn't do anything. Take me to court. And they're saying, listen, you need to plead guilty. Much of my conversations with the refugees is explaining to them how this plea deal process works, because no one wants you to go to court. And to be honest, you don't want a refugee Arabic speaking man to sit in front of a white jury and try and find justice. That is not where they're going to be subjected to a really fair justice system, right? So you actually, unfortunately, do want them to take the plea deal because our system is so fucked up and sets it up to be in that way. And so our clients are very confused what's going on. So already we're not thinking about domestic violence as a family matter. We're thinking about it as a criminal matter, which criminality designates a relationship to the state, right? Being a criminal is not an identity. It's a political relationship. Just like being a refugee is not an identity, it's a political relationship, which becomes an identity, I guess, in our society. Another conversation. Couples counseling is not recommended. Actually, you'll be hard pressed to find any therapist to work with anyone who has violence occurring. If violence is occurring, or if you want therapy, for example, and you have violence in your relationship, you need to stop violence before therapy starts. So let's say, as to use a metaphor, have a deep relationship with heroin and you're addicted to heroin and you want to find help for it, and everyone says, well, stop doing heroin first and then we'll do therapy, which actually is the model in a lot of cases. But when I say it like that, it's kind of ridiculous, right? It's like, well, if not us, who? This is the hegemony of white supremacy, right? We don't want to help families. We want them to go to prison. We want them to go to the criminal and justice system because we start to make money off of you there. Um, and if you find some resources, they're going to be gender specific, individualized, and standardized treatment plans. So it's not a family focused practice. We're going to separate you. You're going to learn things individually through psychoeducational models, coping strategies, whatever. And then when you come back together, it'll be all good and you can move on as a family. And also, all of our practices and our systems are shaped for women leaving abusers, right? Like we have shelters and we have restraining orders. We have all these systems, but nothing, very little to nothing to attend to people who are in violent relationships, want to stay with their partner and figure something out. If you're in that circumstance, you're on your own. And the system will get involved when things get really, really bad. We'll see you at the end of the line or when like things have really caught on fire. Okay, so promoting safety in families, I'll just say this. We do not have a family ethic here in the United States in terms of like the ways our services orient. We do not support families. Okay, so let's promote healthy communities. Well, we have mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence. So if you have intervention and need immediate intervention, it's not just a check-in. The police are going to take someone out, which you can argue is a really good thing. It actually has been argued in it was a court case. I think it's Thurgood versus something. But we have mandatory arrest policies because the cops used to come out, walk the guy around the block, right? And we're talking about a patriarchal institution meeting a patriarchal problem. So cops walk the guy around the block. It's all good, please be mindful that I'm using intentionally cisgendered heterosexual language because that's what this system is set up for. If you're outside that particular structure, the system's not designed to really support you or think about you. Walks around the block, comes back in, and gets murdered. So the family sues, and so now we have mandatory arrest policies. Okay, all good thing. I think it's a good, yeah. Feminists celebrated this immediate access to safety by removing a violent person. However, the mandatory arrest policies dovetail with broader police efforts and the state to reduce citizen rights and increase policing activities and police funding. So yeah, there was this maybe small benefit in creating a context where one person gets removed, but it dovetails with a larger process of creating a very powerful and militarized police force that has a lot of rights over what they can do with you. And all this is located in domestic violence discourse, large being Anglo-Saxon and dismissing and disregarding communities of color and non-white communities. And most famously, the first documented community that was in the United States that was policing for domestic violence was the Ku Klux Klan, because they were trying to promote the perfect white family, the perfect white nuclear family. So then you have a context where CPS, police, law enforcement are going, they have their practices developed off of what the white nuclear family should look like and what the practices of that family looks like. And then they're policing low income communities of color more prominently and subjecting those communities to the white nuclear family model and making interpretations of violence through that model. So the state statistically is significantly more likely to get involved with low-income homes and people of color. And I'll say if you're a therapist or you've been in this context long enough, you'll know that CPS will very quickly or much more quickly remove families or children from families in El Cajon than they will in La Jolla. If you're in La Jolla, it's going to be a nice, slow process. Lawyers will get involved. they'll treat you nicely. But if they interpret you as something else, as someone who won't sue, who doesn't speak English, etc., it'll be a much faster path to getting your children removed or some state involvement. Yeah, so we have very racist distinctions between good and bad homes. So bring community together to end domestic violence. I will say the San Diego Domestic Violence Council does a really good job of creating a collaborative partnership that organizes services. Um, and I'm a part of that council, and I like how they kind of orient and set stuff up. However, the problems are still subjected to a broader American neoliberal capitalist problem, where agencies are competing for clients as businesses. Think about what an unbelievably toxic mentality this is when you're trying to help people. That you're a business, you need to compete with your colleagues because we're trying to get clients and we're sending people into the courts to to wait for people to come. Like literally, I'm describing something that happens. People coming out of the courts, you jump in front of them with a flyer for your program. You say, "Hey, come to our program. You're in a 52-week group, which you have to pay for. That means we have 52 week of assured payment from you." And these are, again, largely low-income families. Um, and for anyone that has run a nonprofit or agency, well, and we're here at SDSU and a university, most grants, most funding goes to administration costs rather than serving the, the population. People lose their minds when they hear that License to Freedom, 95% of our money goes to the program and the support with the families, and 5% goes to administration, which if you ask any of our team, they can affirm because it puts big strain on all of us. But also, because we're all doing admin work as well as doing therapy and everything else. And also, yeah, we're trying to figure out how to manage that. But if we're trying to be client-centered versus staff-centered, as a really important ethical distinction, then I really necessarily want to be very careful of my admin costs growing. And we saw this during Black Lives Matters. You know, people are like, oh, we need more professors of color, blah, blah. And so the universities, the response is, let's hire 15 deans of diversity and have a committee for 3 years to figure out this issue. Millions of dollars later, they're like, maybe we should have faculty of color. And you're like, oh, what a fucking brilliant idea. Um, Okay, so now we're going to provide trainings and educations for the community about domestic violence, which is a really good effort. But what ends up happening is now we're universalizing experience of domestic violence, right? Like, this is how it happens. And how it happens is shaped by Judeo-Christian, patriarchal, white nuclear family models that make sense of intimate partnerships through a cisgendered, heterosexual, monogamous set of relationships. So if you're outside of that, good luck. And even for those people that are in those contexts, I don't know how well the system works. And then what happens is in these trainings, we have these psychoeducational models that create truths about an experience that are a priori, meaning we have these theories and assumptions about what happens that we apply to people's lives versus letting people's lives and experience create a theory or conceptualization for us, if that makes sense. So it's like a top-down application versus a bottom-up meaning-making system. If you want funding, you need to adhere to these ideas, like the Duluth model. Like you won't get funding unless you adhere to this specific set of standards and assumptions about domestic violence work. And all of our services are saturated in gender essentialism, meaning domestic violence happens primarily and only in gendered contexts, which is a fine conceptualization, except that it obscures other things going on, like class, immigration, sexual assaults, colonial histories, racist histories, right? Like it obscures all the other things that influence the emergence of violence within an intimate partnership. Okay, so we want to build resilience and self-sufficiency. Well, the ways that the system is set up is that women are either leaving or staying in relationships. We don't really have much conceptualization or services to address people trying to think things out, figure something, maybe be in a context of like both leaving and staying. It's like if you're the services are you're staying or you're leaving, and we have assessments and practices addressed to either state. And so I really like this quote from this author that women are juxtaposed with mutually exclusive and seemingly exhaustive dichotomy in which they're staying or leaving. And then, as part of the broader American propaganda and ongoing lubrication to war, is the idea that has generated from white feminism is that we need white women to save brown women from brown men, right? And this is kind of like the Hillary Clinton thing, right? Like we got to go into Saudi Arabia and like liberate. And the whole image that I feel like people have is like we're gonna take these like immigrant Muslim women out of their family, these violent relationships with these like angry, scary Arab men that we have all these like propagandized images of. We're gonna take him to the shelter. They're gonna rip off their hijab, and it's like amazing liberatory act, and it's just so fucking ridiculous. And we have like this very clear line of how liberation looks in the United States, and that as if we Americans invented the notion of freedom. We were very, very committed to that idea. Um, and also, if you want to make a small business in the United States, basically as anyone, it's very difficult because you're competing with Walmarts and Walgreens and all the other wall things. But you're going to compete with major corporate conglomerates. So there is no like small business next chapter of your life energy. It's you're going to probably end up working multiple jobs while also getting help from the state and needing to go to food drives and all the different things that kind of like the story that Doc was describing earlier. Okay, so Navid, this is so dark. Yes, it is dark. It is dismal. A lot of, again, the river, right? There's people pulling babies out the river, but this camp has taken over. It's a very big camp, and it's very stratified and organized and hierarchical. And we have this thing called money that privileges, or, well, that we start to see all of our services through rather than our clients. So we want to heal from trauma and violence. And as a therapist, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to help people do. Well, the best practices are often shaped by, they reflect the values of the funders of research. So they reflect the interests of the states, the federal government, insurance, law enforcement. Most of the funding for domestic violence, majority comes from law enforcement and criminal justice systems. And that is a post-Reagan administration thing that has just not, we haven't decoupled from that in any way. We have a lot of psychological assumptions about abuse, and a lot of the research and practices go into the ways that we start to psychologize violence and the ways that like there's a psychology of abuse, and we start to locate it in personality disorders like narcissism and etc. Which might be helpful and nice in some contexts, but strips the politics of experience, right? Like psychology tends to decontextualize an experience and create innate internalized locations for why something is happening. And in our very American way, we have extremely punitive models of healing. So we want people to talk to accountability, and we want you to talk in a very specific way. And your stories need to sound very particular. So if you're coming up against Border Patrol and you're doing VAWA, Violence Against Women's Act, your story needs to be a particular, and excuse my language here, but I'm using it intentionally. You need to have a sexy story of trauma to sell the immigration officer that you're a worthy recipient of a United States green card or visa. Like you have to construct this nice trauma story. And if anyone's worked with trauma, you know that that is an extremely challenging thing to do. And like CPS and the ways that they create very problematic identities of the people they're trying to help. So mom failed to protect her children, and therefore the state needs to intervene, which is an unbelievably tragic thing to hear when you're trying to leave a violent relationship and the complexities of doing so, to be confronted with the notion that you're a bad mom, institutionalized that you're a bad mom. Okay, well, we're going to empower people to leave relationships. Well, the services are conditional, and they need to fit certain criteria to receive services. Our DV services are gap services to address failures of the states. We have zero social safety networks social safety nets for families to leave violence. Often women are choosing, or families are choosing between violence or poverty. And it makes sense why a lot of people choose violence because it's known. You can predict it, you can manage it, you can navigate it. Poverty has this whole vicious cycle of unknowns that you have to constantly navigate every day. Um, so, so yeah, shelters become gap services for a lack of housing. Food drives become a lack of services for, or kind of fill the gap for just a lack of access to food, healthcare, all this stuff. It's very frustrating. Okay, so we're going to bring accountability to harm done. Well, arrest only works for men who have nothing to lose by being arrested. Oh, sorry, only works for men with something to lose. A lot of the communities I work with, like I'm thinking about several of our clients right now. Imagine this: you're an immigrant, you don't speak the language, you're arrested by the police, you lose access to being able to work and work permits, your citizenship is on the line, you're homeless now because of the restraining order, and not because of the restraining order, but because there's nowhere else for you to go. And we don't basically we isolate these men and these people. So you don't have a home, you don't have a job, you don't have a family, you have nothing to lose. And then we're like, well, like the police will intervene. Well, if the police can find him, it's very hard to find people living in their cars. And yeah, it just continues to aggravate and corner someone who's already aggravated and cornered, if that makes sense. Um, I'm just going to keep kind of hopping forward just for the sake of time. Um, Legal realms are unfortunately contexts where you have to play out who's the victim. And much of the therapy language that we're necessarily required to use is legalese. Like this victim perpetrator binary comes from the legal world, which I won't comment on because I'm not a lawyer. But like it is not a useful set of language for therapists or other helpers because it's just too simplistic. It's a very oversimplified approach. Um, And part of the challenge is that those oversimplifications mask a very deep colonial history. They mask the history of colonization, sexual violence, human trafficking, um, and just a long legacy of white supremacy here in the United States. And and the thing I want to say too here is that item 3 on this piece that I put here. So this image is the AI is generating an image when I put in colonial trouble. So it's kind of interesting. I was grateful to see the British flag strung in there. Smart little AI. Um, but that sharing experiences of violence with outside community leaves your community vulnerable to already existing racist perspectives. This is a really big challenge for us when the Afghan refugees were coming in, have been coming in, is this sense of like, we're already not viewed well by the community. How do we protect our identity and our community from those racist propaganda while also trying to get help? And I will tell you, like so many experiences with CPS workers in particular, but just services in general, where people are like, oh, like we need to teach these women. I can't tell you how many times I've heard white women say about, like, for example, my Afghan client, like, she needs to learn how to make better choices about her relationship and who she's going to marry. Well, she was in an arranged marriage at 12 or 14. I also don't want to say that because that furthers this idea they have about what Afghan women do. So the next meeting, she's talking to a white therapist about her Afghan client, saying like, these Afghanis and arranged marriages, and like we have a very particular relationship with arranged marriages in the United States. So even myself, it's so funny. My team knows my family's Muslim. I don't, and happy Ramadan to those celebrating. I don't really do anything Muslim. Actually, like I don't know. I'm just not very religious. And I just feel like it's so funny whenever I'm in these United States contexts and like talking pro Muslim stuff. Like I'm like trying to protect Islam. And like I have a lot of problems with Islam myself. And in my conversation with my family, I'm like the other side where I'm like, ah, you guys, like, it's not a big deal. Like, who cares? Whatever. Like, we have our own dialogue about it. But in US context, in the context of Islamophobia, I end up having to like defend something. There's not much room for nuance. Okay. So, the politics of revolutionary love. What are some of the ways that I'm interested or kind of like attending to or trying to like turn to these issues in a useful way? That image is the politics of revolutionary love from an AI. So I thought it was kind of neat. So And this little image here is imaginative, intelligent, playful creatures. And so this is from a quote from a book that I really like, that's kind of talking about the ways that prehistoric man is subjected to this very European analysis of man as equal and then coming into problem, or man as savage and problems and then coming into civility through the imposition of the states. That's a whole nother conversation. But the domestic violence narratives of families are subjected to a very similar discourse, which is families are chaotic and they come into state agencies and services and find peacefulness in something. Um, and this idea that like we need to teach people in the ways that domestic violence services are positioned to help, kind of like impose help onto families. And I wonder like what if we imagine people as imaginative, intelligent, and playful, and that rather than like how we fell from some idyllic state of equality, which I find a lot of problems with the language of inequality, but that's for another conversation. That we how do we become trapped in conceptual shackles that make our imagination of what's possible really limited. So the politics of revolutionary love. Actually, I'm going to pop forward really quick, and then I'll come back. A post-structural decolonial feminism accounts for the ways that gender influences the dynamics of intimate relationships, but also attends to the influences of immigration, war, poverty, north-south global relations, and neoliberalism, right? Like how these other huge political structures are also influencing things. And it's basically an invitation into an accountability into our own assumptions and a more nuanced, broad perspective on power dynamics, which sounds really simple and obvious, perhaps. But I kind of say this like with, thank you, Marcella. I think about some of the linguistic justice work that Marcella does and I've been doing with her and the team has written on. It's very American work, right? Because we're responding to a very monolingual landscape where we're like, guess what? Maybe speaking more than one language is helpful, right? Like it's a very like American dialogue in my opinion, where you're responding to and this is kind of how I feel like this is responding. It's responding to a very American landscape. We're very oversimplified, very step by step standardized approaches to complex issues, and saying like how do we step back and be a little bit careful about those oversimplifications, and also like be really careful about our histories with punishments and discipline, and the ways that we might be inclined to like swat away people's context to get to some psychological understanding of an experience, and say that what if we're in dialogue and compassion and understanding and also maintaining accountability, kind of like the ways that Doquaz is describing earlier in her work with to in response to Marcella's question, right? It's like, yeah, the men are part of the picture. We're how do we kind of keep an eye on the family as a unit rather than these like individualized gender specific treatment models? So the politics of revolutionary love for me in the domestic violence world look like moving away from this is the movement of discourse, like the ideas that I want that I experience as being kind of having a pretty powerful hold on the thinking of the field and my hopeful direction it would go to. So from individualized deviancy, right, that like domestic violence is just like an aberrant act, to there's structural inequality, there's problems structurally occurring that lead to violence. That domestic violence is a war of genders that has always existed, which is a very colonial way of thinking, because you're most research indicates that gender trouble is a colonial import export, which is a euphemism, but was imposed upon communities of color and like West African communities through the slave trade and the Native American communities in North America that the Puritans came in contact with. That Christian, very narrow perspective of how to be in a relationship was imposed on those communities, and then we turn to them and say, "Why are you having trouble?" Right? Um, So, towards the historical and cultural construction of a normalization of gendered violence. So, how do we take into account that history? From static notions of nature bound jealousy to fluid understandings of culture, right? And this is a big one in our work at License to Freedom is how do we work with immigrants and refugees whose culture is already under threat by various forces, but also invite some considerations that might open up other possibilities in our life, right? Because sometimes we can fall into this place of, well, they're an oppressed group, their culture's already under threat. I don't want to poke and prod at their culture already. It's too vulnerable. It might be unethical or unhelpful. To that question, I think I hope that's a fair place I think to stand. But also I think there's some practices and ways to be in some questions. And this is where narrative becomes helpful for me. Like there's some decentered but influential ways to center someone's knowledge and invite some questions about usefulness or helpfulness across various contexts that might make visible um, this fluid, dynamic nature of culture and what's possible, right? Like the ways that your culture is now meeting necessarily another culture. From universal theories to local contextualized inquiries and understandings, from a focus on criminalized populations to the inclusion of those who do not who do not appear in domestic violence studies, LGBTQ communities, non-English speaking communities, Middle Eastern communities, non-monogamous communities, whatever, right? Like the huge body of people not represented by DV work. And then from like ubiquitous safety planning, and if you've been in a DV field, you'll know that you have worksheets to do safety planning that are standardized and they attend to your liability as a clinician. Rather, to how it is that people are in active strategies of resistance, making those visible, perhaps co-authoring and offering some practices that you might have as well, um, to create strategies of resistance that are local, contextualized, and don't have to be documented because you're worried about liability issues, if that makes sense. So again, my hope is that there's some ways that we can integrate understandings of immigration and neoliberalism, neocolonialism. I wrote an article for the Union Tribune several years ago, and I mentioned I was writing about some of the work I've done with the men's group, and well, it's the Union Tribune, so you never know who reads those opinion pieces. But the one comment I got was from this person. I basically was just saying that like a lot of violence and harm has been imposed on Middle Eastern communities from since 9/11. Because imagine the example I share is imagine 20 Russians. Okay, no, it's not the Russian thing. Let's go a different direction. 20 Finnish people from Finland, let's just say, come over to the United States. Or I'm sorry, let's say 20 Americans of like a fringe group go to Finland, attack it, and then Finland says, "Time to bomb the United States wholly and destroy their entire country." Also, while we're at it, we're gonna go bomb Guatemala too because they may have been peripherally involved. That's effectively what we did to Afghanistan. Was some guy loosely associated with and living in Afghanistan organized 13 other people, bombed the United States. We're gonna kill millions of people across the region. Was the American response. So, and so in the article, the one comment I got was someone being like, how dare you even try and like put that Middle Eastern propaganda on us Americans? We were protecting our freedom. How dare you? So even like the notion that like you could consider colonialism or North-South relations or something like that is a big ask, I think. But I'm hopeful in our movements as a society. How do we bring in some additional assessments? We have the immigrant danger assessment, which is a nice tool. The problem with these tools, though, I will say, is that they often take the central heterosexual, cisgendered, white assessment and we add a couple questions and then we say it's the immigrant danger assessment or something. Or the power control wheel, we add a different pie to slice for the queer communities and we're like, there it is, the LGBTQ power control circle. So we're still maintaining a centered study based on a dominant group of people. This statement is small, but its reflection in our services would be significant. To make services for families and create context for families to be in dialogue. What are contexts right now where families in crises, and I'd put the charge to you, if you're in private practice or if you're in some context, would you meet with couples in violence? And if not, why not? right? There's a also, if you're interested in that question, just a shameless plug here. I am doing some research for my dissertation on that question, and if you want to be a participant and you're an MFT in my thing, let me know. Um, what do we create context for families to be in dialogue? How do we like kind of make space for the ideas that men are victims of patriarchy as well, right? If we're looking at social structures, the ways of both men and women and uh, non-binary folks and queer communities, all of us are kind of victims to this patriarchal system that takes hold. Um, yeah, and like, how do we like kind of create context where we can learn about the mediums, preferred mediums of healing people want to be in? um, and models of restitution that privilege the power and influence of families rather than that of the institution, right? Because again, if a family is seeking help from violence and they call the police for help, they're going to have to follow the path that the police and courts, agencies down the line create for them. They're going to have to follow their treatment plan. There's very little space. And once an institution like CPS locks their jaws onto something like a particular understanding, it's very difficult to get them to like shift their perspective. And here's my thing, one of my things. We demand accountability for the people that perpetrate violence in their relationships, which I think is fine. I'm one of those people. I stand for uh, inviting accountability. Those same institutions that demand accountability have zero forms of accountability for themselves. It is impossible to bring CPS, law enforcement, courts, and judges into a sense of accountability. They're demanding accountability for others and refuse to take accountability for themselves. In the history of the Border Patrol, there has never been a single Border Patrol agent ever who has ever been um, fined, removed from their position, or brought into any scrutiny and accountability for any of their actions that are taken. So it's kind of like the feeling I get when the bank says, "Hey, pay us within one business day, or we're going to charge you $35." And then when you need to get money back from them, they're like, "See you in 8 to 10 business days." And you're like, "Oh wow, when you need my money, it takes seconds, but to get anything back from you, you can have like all month." And that's kind of what the DV field feels like. It's like, you guys need to be accountable. Don't talk to us though. We're doing our job. So this domestic violence work, it's very prone. Its history and its legacy is beautiful in a lot of ways. But the progressive nations, it hoods a very racist, white supremacist, anti-immigrant set of sentiments within this kind of like progressive hood that it wears. And so it's susceptible to the politics and agendas of law enforcement, the courts, immigration officers, therapists and psychologists, social workers. Um, and I think that if you want to go upstream, you need to be an activist. If you want to dismantle the camp that is invested in sustaining the camp rather than getting the babies out of the river, you're going to have to be an activist. You're going to have to ruffle some feathers. And there's some ways that I think those acts of resistance are both on the micro, they're in the macro, they're small and visible sometimes, they're loud and seen. Grateful to Marcella for making a context where some of that can be seen. And I'm hopeful that as you go through the rest of the day, you can see some of the both mini and massive forms of resistance that the team is putting forward to um, address some institutionalized trouble. So I'm going to stop there.